Crisis communications, what can go wrong will go wrong, was the mantra of the original crash test dummy, Lieutenant Colonel John Stapp. Now, Stapp was a contemporary of the more famous Right Stuff pilots like Chuck Yeager, and in my view, he should be the patron saint of crisis comms because what can go wrong will go wrong, in effect, not if but when, makes a great starting point when preparing any organisation for a crisis. That, and my other favourite crisis comms quote, hope for the best, plan for the worst, uttered by Lee Child's fictional character, Jack Reacher.
At an air development center in New Mexico, a rocket-propelled sled is made ready. With an Air Force officer in the seat, the sled, powered by 9 rockets, will race along its tracks at a speed of more than 600 miles an hour. The officer, Lieutenant Colonel Stapp, has been the guinea pig on many such tests, but none at such an incredible speed. He wears no special uniform for the run, which simulates the effects experienced by pilots bailing out from supersonic aircraft. The sirens have sounded the warning, and all is set. The slow-motion camera records Stapp's run. Within 5 seconds, he's traveling at 632 miles an hour, a new land speed record by more than 200 miles an hour. His speed is equivalent to more than 1,000 miles an hour at the normal cruising altitude of jet planes. Water brakes bring the sled to a halt within a second and a half. A medical checkup reveals that Stapp is unharmed after his record run.
Now, you may be working in a much less inherently dangerous sector than Stapp, but reputationally at least, you and your organisation could crash at any time into the buffers. What can go wrong will go wrong. So be a survivor like John Stapp and plan meticulously, or hope for the best but plan for the worst like Jack Reacher. And in either case, make sure your plans are flexible. Flexible because of this fella. Unlike Jack Reacher, a real-life soldier with a forgettable name, but an unforgettable and apposite quote. No plan survives contact with the enemy. His name, for the record, Helmuth Karl Bernhard Graf von Moltke the Elder. At least I think that's it. No more quotes, no more funny names. Well, maybe one more funny name, but not yet. Now, there are 3 distinct phases in crisis comms, and this slideshow, and indeed the workshop that you've attended, were broken into these 3 distinct phases: BC, DC, and AC. Before crisis, you've got it. During crisis, and yet you're ahead of me, after crisis. There are things that you must do organisationally at each stage, and indeed perhaps not do as well at each stage. So let's have a little bit of a look at the BC, before crisis stage. The first thing to do is, of course, to anticipate the crises. Identify your crisis comms team or teams if it's a big organisation. Designate your spokespeople well in advance. Draw up key messages and holding statements for those spokespeople so that they've actually got something to say. Establish your internal communications audiences and channels, and of course determine the external audiences and channels. And we'll drill down into each of these in a bit more detail in due course. Let's have a quick look at the DC, the during crisis phase. Assessing the situation, being situationally aware, is crucially important because it allows you to adapt the plans that you've made accordingly. You can deliver messages during the crisis in 2 ways, principally, proactively or reactively. In reality, most organisations do a little bit of both. One needs to reassess the crisis and monitor the coverage, in other words, to redo the situational awareness fairly regularly in order to adapt the plan and deliver a new set of messages. And then there's the much shorter, although not always shorter, after crisis phase, where you do a debrief, the hot one and the cold one. The hot one whilst matters are still fresh in your mind, the cold one after a period of reflection 2 or 3 days or even 2 or 3 weeks later. Different things emerge from each, and both debrief sessions are valuable. identifying any remaining reputational issues, and making sure that you restore, insofar as you're able to, your organizational reputation with longer term messaging and communications, reassessing those plans and adapting them where necessary so that you're much better for future crises. Reassessing also the team structure, the dynamics, the way that people got on with one another or perhaps didn't, the performance, and in the light of that reassessment of the team, adapting and changing it to achieve what is going to be closer to peak performance, all being well, on the next occasion. And that reassessment includes being a critical friend, critiquing the spokespeople. If it's not you, then who? Making sure that their messaging and delivery was as good as it could be. So here's a picture to grapple with. It's called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Death, Famine, War and Conquest, and it's an 1887 painting by the Russian artist Viktor Vaznetsov. And if you look very carefully in the little gap in the cloud right at the very top center, you'll see a lamb is visible. In a sense, the lamb is you. I'm asking you to look at this picture because you need to be staring at your organization's event horizon, if I can put it that way, and try to work out what apocalypse looks like for you in your sector. In other words, to anticipate the crises. What could possibly go wrong? It may be an internally triggered or an externally triggered event. It could be human, it could be non-human, the so-called act of God. It might be a reputational issue. It could be a regulatory issue. It may be a financial issue. And if you're struggling, I suggest that you just Google yourself, your organization, your sector, with a series of words like scandal and disaster and problem, and see what you come up with. Quite quickly, when you Google council leader scandal, you come up with council executives and elected members who have been enjoying, in this case, lavish meals at the council taxpayers' expense. Now, if you're going to go about this crisis comms planning in a very structured way, and I suggest you should, when you draw up your long list of potential crises, give them a score, 1 to 10 on impact, where 1 is very low impact and 10 is very high impact. Impact, that is, on your ability to continue as a business or as an organization. And then you give it a second score where 1 is a very low likelihood and 10 is a very high likelihood. And what you're looking for is some sense of risk. Risk is likelihood multiplied by impact. So something that's very likely and has a huge impact is going to have a risk score of 100. Something that's of little consequence and very unlikely to happen is in effect going to have a risk score of 1. Of course, what the lesson of Grenfell Tower showed us was that even things that are highly, highly unlikely, the fire service itself thought the fire there was hugely unlikely, can end up happening, if not when. So Grenfell Tower originally would have had quite a low likelihood, even though the impact was huge. So it wouldn't have been seen as a huge risk. And I guess the lesson from something like Grenfell is that all scenarios need to be planned for. But of course you have finite resources, both in terms of people and money. So you've got to start somewhere. So you start planning for the more likely, higher risk situations, but don't leave off the bottom of that list the things that are of huge consequence potentially, even though they are very unlikely to happen. It's not a case of when, sadly, it's a case of if. So the next stage, having drawn up a long list of things that you need to plan for, is to identify your crisis comms team for each. Maybe the same team for all of them, it may be slightly different teams depending on how your organization works and how big it is. So who are the personnel? Who are you actually going to get in your team? And what sort of decision-making ability do they have? If they're too far removed from decision-making, it may take so long to get something signed off. The communication chain may be so long that frankly it disables you in your ability to react quickly to a crisis. So command chains ideally need to be short. The media and comms people at the very least need to be at the immediate left or right hand of chief executives and senior managers. So have a think about the structure. Location, geographical location is going to be important as well. You may be metaphorically at the right hand of the chief executive, but if in effect you're in a different building or even in a different part of the same building, that can end up stretching those command chains to breaking point. So where are you going to be located, and is your location robust? Do you need to identify a second or even a third location if your anticipated location isn't going to be usable? It's rendered useless by flooding, by terrorism, by evacuation policies and so on. What kind of resources do you need? I don't just mean personnel, I also mean the sort of financial resources, the phones, the computers, high-vis tabards, loudhailers, computers, logging, paper, pens, the whole damn lot. Now, the next thing to consider are your internal comms audiences and channels. External comms are only ever as good as internal comms allow. So you need to identify your internal communications lines. Who do you need to speak to, and who needs to speak to you? And how is that going to be facilitated? Can that communication be word of mouth? Can you rely on a mobile phone system? How robust is that likely to be when the systems are full almost to capacity because of a huge area-wide crisis or issue? And how are you going to share messages? Is a WhatsApp group a sensible way forward? Using external technology for internal comms could be the go. And then, of course, there are the external audiences and channels to consider. Who do you need to talk to? Stakeholders. If you're a hospital trust, you might need to talk internally to your staff, nurses, doctors, non-medical staff. Externally, you'll need to talk to patients, you'll need to talk to social services, you'll perhaps need to talk to the emergency services. Who's going to be listening? Not everybody is necessarily listening. You might have an external audience, but if they ain't listening, there's problems. Where are you going to communicate with them? Local radio, regional television. These days, of course, the social web. All of those are running quite quickly and keeping up with the pace of developments. Local newspapers, even daily newspapers, with their 24-hour and sometimes 7-day deadlines, much less effective as communications channels. We could do a whole workshop, frankly, on social media, especially on Twitter. It's not the brief of this short slideshow to get too much into that. Suffice to say that if you do want to test your organisational ability to deal with the social media element of crisis comms, then we would point you in the direction of our socialmediatestbed.com tool, the socialmediatestbed.com, which just gives you a chance to exercise in a hugely realistic way the kinds of problems thrown up by the volume and speed of communications on the social web. Broadcast media is certainly going to be one of your potential external audience channels, and there may be other outlets that you need to consider in advance. Designating your spokespeople is the next step. They've got to be the right people with the right skills, the right position. By that I mean there's no point in wheeling out a lowly manager when something really huge has happened in your organisation. There's going to be an expectation that it is a fairly senior person in a senior position, if not the chief executive, her or himself. They've got to have the right training. They may be very good as chief executives, they may be less able as spokespeople. So it's a lot to ask them to be good spokespeople in a crisis. So their right skills, the right position, seniority, the right training. What do I mean by everybody's a potential spokesperson? Well, in the old days, there was a very clear hierarchical structure to communications. But these days, with the ubiquity of mobile phones and with the social web I was talking about a few moments ago, everybody in your organization is a potential spokesperson. Everybody can champion or can detract from the reputation of your organization. So internal comms are really important because of the much flatter structure of organizational communications in this day and age, where everybody is a potential spokesperson. Inevitably, your organization is going to be leaky. It's not possible to keep bad news away from the public in this day and age. Even unintentionally, your colleagues, your staff, your suppliers, your stakeholders, your patients, whoever they happen to be, are going to leak whatever it is that you might in a previous time have reasonably expected to keep, if not secret, private for a little longer. And if everybody's a potential spokesperson, then you all need to be singing from the same proverbial hymn sheet. It doesn't really matter who the spokesperson is if the message is the same. So what key messages, what holding statements can be devised in advance? What are your spokespeople going to say? What do they need to say? How much of what they need to say can be determined in advance? The media beast needs to be fed. If you say nothing, you leave a vacuum into which leaps, rushes all sorts of second-hand gossip and idle speculation, which may be wrong, but actually may be very difficult to put right reputationally if you haven't got in there, if not first, at least fairly swiftly. The media has a voracious appetite. I'm not suggesting you feed it just for the sake of feeding it. What I'm saying is that if you don't feed it, you might find that you lose control of the beast, you lose control of the message. No comment is rarely sensible. It again leaves too much space for idle speculation and gossip. And people read all sorts of significance into those two bald words, no comment. If you can't say something, we'll explain why you can't say something. But in most cases, there is always something to say, even if it's what's happening right now. Actions speak louder than words. So if you're doing something to help people, tell them. Tell the public what you're doing to help. Your actions will speak louder than words. Saying sorry is important and all very well, but demonstrating through your actions that you're sorry is going to be very important. And it's possible to pre-populate a communications matrix. Those of you who have been to our media training workshops will be much more familiar with this concept of a matrix than others. Column 1, the key messages. Column 2, the facts and figures that evidence to the rational mind. Those key messages come assertions, and then in column 3, the narrative, the stories that can help engage an audience at an emotional level with what's being said. The stories providing, if you like, the illustration to soften the otherwise hard and dry and dusty facts. So during a crisis, assessing the situation is going to be really very important indeed. Adapting those key messages, those holding statements, it's no shame. They're not going to last the crisis, but it's better to have something to work from than to start from scratch. But you need to be aware of the situation. Those internal comms channels are so important for that reason, so that you can adapt your key messages and your holding statements accordingly. Delivering them, holding a line can be hard, can't it? Not being cajoled or bullied or forced in any way to answer questions that you can't answer or have no business to answer at that stage. So it is challenging, and in a crisis, being a media spokesperson is perhaps the most challenging of all. One of the ways of not stepping too far beyond your brief is to actually have a written statement rather than to give a spoken interview, where, because you're extemporizing, you might be inclined to say too much. So written statements do have a place. I'd urge you to think about that in the before crisis phase and perhaps rehearse it, see what it seems like. One-to-one and one-to-many interviews, a 1+1 obviously is okay if there's only one person to interview you, but if the media are out in force, doing a series of one-to-ones can take an awful long time, and you can end up spending most of your time doing interviews and less of your time, for example, bringing yourself up to speed with the latest situation. And it may be better to do a press conference, a one-to-many, if you like, and you might have to spend half an hour to an hour setting up and delivering a press conference, but it's certainly going to be quicker and more controlled than a series of open-ended one-to-ones, live and pre-recorded. And of course, during the crisis, one needs to monitor what people are saying about you, making sure you keep an eye on TV, an ear on radio news, and insofar as it's possible, keeping an eye on what's being said about you reputationally on the social web, so that you can adapt and deliver fresh or changed messages as a consequence of that monitoring. And then there's the after-crisis phase. We touched on it briefly in our workshop. A hot debrief is one that you conduct whilst matters are still fresh in everybody's mind, if you like, before they go home that night. That will capture all sorts of interesting stuff whilst, as I say, fresh in people's mind. A cold debrief should also be conducted. That's one where people have a chance to reflect a little more carefully and dispassionately on the heat of the moment. That might be a few days later, it might be a week later, much beyond a week later, and of course things may have been forgotten completely. So a hot debrief and a cold debrief are really important, because then you have some learning which can be applied to the situation so that you get better in future when the next crisis, similar or different, emerges. So in summary, remember, what can go wrong will go wrong. That was John Stapp's mantra. So hope for the best, but plan for the worst. That was Jack Reacher's mantra. And make sure your plans are flexible, because no plan survives contact with a crisis. And that was the German or the Austrian general's quote. His name escapes me. You need to designate, train and test your spokespeople in advance so that everybody's ready. You can pre-populate your crisis comms matrix with your key messages, the clear and concise stuff, the facts and figures, the rational stuff, and the stories, that's the emotional stuff. Talk about what you're doing, because actions speak louder than words, and apologise at the earliest opportunity. For further information and the latest thinking on crisis comms, go to the ACM Training blog, blog.acmtraining.co.uk, and follow the category Crisis Comms.